To participants, I say I'm very sorry that we couldn't invite you to campus and host you properly, but we hope to do that at some point in the future. On the other hand, I'm thrilled to see so many of you here today online from all around the world. I'm extremely happy to see a conference like this that thematizes the connections of the subcontinent with surrounding regions. I'm here mainly to thank those who are making this event happen. First, Shivalika Kohli for her terrific design of the website. Anisha Padma, Irene Pramod, and Swagat Pani for their work in framing the theme and organizing speakers and talks. Clemente Beghi, our administrator in the Center for South Asian Studies, has done terrific work on the planning and logistics side. Finally, thank you to your chief organizer, Professor Jatin Dua, for his work in bringing all of us together around this important topic. With that, I'll turn it over to Professor Dua.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for joining us today. We're delighted, and as Professor Hull mentioned, we would have loved to have hosted you all in person, but hopefully, this gives us an opportunity to begin a conversation, and that hopefully will continue in various forms. In the interest of time, I'll start quickly soon introducing our first panel, but before that, I wanted to lay out a little of how this conference came about and the ways in which we're thinking together about these questions of race, capitalism, and mobility, and thinking capaciously about this category of South Asia. My name is Jatin Dua. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan and director of the Interdepartmental Program in Anthropology and History. Along with Anisha Padma, Irene Pramod, and Swagat Pani, I'm one of the organizers of this conference. Our goal in the next few days and in bringing this conference together was to begin by thinking capaciously about this category of South Asia, begin by thinking of what happens when we think South Asia beyond its borders, when we think of it within various kinds of regional processes and projects, and beyond that, to bring into conversation what we see as two significant turns that are happening in South Asian studies, but also transregional studies more broadly. One is a thinking of a kind of reinvigorated thinking about questions of mobility in seemingly immobile times, and specifically in moving beyond the framing of diaspora and migration, particularly from South Asia or with South Asia, as something that is new and always oriented towards Euro-America. And in conversation with scholars working in Indian Ocean studies, inter-Asia, as well as Africa, Asia, there has been a way of thinking mobility as always transregional, as always producing old and new forms of linkages. At the same time, these linkages happen within increasing forms of immobility. Global pandemics, surveillance regimes, and borders engender old and new forms of captivity and incarceration throughout the region and beyond. So part of what we wanted to do was think critically about these tensions of mobility and immobility, about the tensions that happen when we frame this conversation, not thinking simply in an axis that looks to North America or looks to the United Kingdom in particular when thinking about South Asia and questions around migration and diaspora, but embraces regional and transregional spatial units. And then bringing this in conversation with a rich and productive scholarship that has focused on a set of framings around questions of caste, race, and the role of South Asia within conceptual vocabularies. So our goal here is not only to think about mobility of people, goods, idea, but also of ideas and concepts, and see where the role of South Asia is in the generation and critiquing of various concepts, particularly concepts around race and caste and their seeming locations either in North America or India and vice versa. So with that in mind, I want to dive right into our first panel, and then which takes on many of these themes head on, in particular in critiquing the sort of framework of nation states and the kind of methodological nationalism within which the question of the nation has often been written and understood. This panel is delighted that our two discussants today who are joining us are Professor Neelofer Qadir, who is an assistant professor in of international and global studies, as well as English at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She's a scholar and teacher of contemporary literary and cultural studies of the Global South, with a focus on the Indian Ocean world. Currently, Professor Qadir is working on her first book, Afro-Asian Imaginaries, Global Capitalism and Labor Migration in Indian Ocean Fiction, as well as a second project on the intersections of global capitalism and carceral statecraft that focuses on an archive of literature, political speeches, government documents, and digital and social media. Joining Professor Qadir as our second discussant is Professor Nurfadzilah Yahaya, who's a legal historian of the Indian Ocean and an assistant professor in the history department at the National University of Singapore. We're delighted to have you here, especially given time zones. And Professor Yahaya was a research fellow at the Asia Research Institute at NUS until June 2016, and is the editor of the World History Legal blog and on humanities and social sciences. She received her PhD in history from Princeton University and was a postdoctoral fellow in Islamic studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Her book, Fluid Jurisdictions, tells a wide-ranging, geographically ambitious tale of the Arab diaspora within and across contexts of British and Dutch colonialism in Southeast Asia, unpacking this community's ambiguous embrace both of European colonial authority and various ways of using particularly colonial law to make various kinds of claims within Southeast Asia and beyond. It's a marvelous, sort of a beautifully ambitious book, and highly recommended. And her current research project focuses on histories of land reclamation in Southeast Asia. Our panelists for today are Vipin Krishna, who is a graduate student in the history department at the University of California, Los Angeles, Dr. Vindhya Buthpitiya, who is at the University of St. Andrews, Dr. Uttara Shahani, who's at the University of Oxford, and finally Haider Shahbaz, who's also a graduate student at the University of California, Los Angeles. And our format, given this online setting, is a little different. Instead of traditional papers, what we have is we will begin with our discussants, giving us mini keynotes that lay out some of the broader themes of these panels, and then dive into a 5-minute per presenter, a short summary of these papers. The videos of these papers have been made available to you when you registered on the website. So we're assuming that we're all coming in having having looked at these prior to this. And then we begin with discussant remarks specifically on the papers before opening the conversation to everyone here. So without further ado, I will hand it over now to our discussants. And I guess I don't know which order you would like to proceed in, but I will just sort of, I hope either Fadzila
Perhaps
or
Professor
Neelofer.
Yahaya can go first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I'll go first.
Perfect. Thank you. Welcome, Professor Yahaya.
Thank you, Jatin, for inviting me to be a discussant. I have been called upon to reflect on how the papers on this panel affect my thinking about my own research and vice versa. The 4 papers of this panel speak to my research in different ways. I will offer a comparative perspective in my comments later on. Some of the papers deal with water and land as distinct spaces. And I've been beginning to take this more seriously in my current book project on history of land reclamation in the British Empire. Mainly, I was struck by the notion of a hinterland. The Indian subcontinent lends its name to the vast maritime space known as the Indian Ocean, because it's the largest entity which also lies at the center of the ocean. In terms of land-water ratio compared to other countries along the Indian Ocean, India, in my opinion, is more land. The coastline is long, but in terms of proportion compared to places like Zanzibar and Oman, and the archipelago on the extreme eastern end of the Indian Ocean in Southeast Asia, India's power is more on land. In my own work, I focus on the eastern end of the Indian Ocean, where the hinterland often recedes. In fact, historically, there was no hinterland in many places in maritime Southeast Asia, which today encompasses the nation states of Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, East Timor, and the Philippines. This is because many places up to the late 19th century were thinly populated along the coasts. It was only recently in the past 150 years that people settled inland in droves, not least due to colonial resettlement of peoples. The coasts in Southeast Asia, being an island world, are extremely long. So they cover a lot of ground. Hardly any coastline in Southeast Asia was empty. Life was oriented towards the sea. The waterfront is where it's at, so to speak. Of course, the interior was not empty, but historically, the middle sections of islands in Southeast Asia and also the Malay Peninsula, which is actually part of mainland Southeast Asia, just jutting out of the mainland. So the islands of Sumatra, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula, which juts out of mainland Southeast Asia, are mountainous and filled with very dense rainforests. As a result, they were underpopulated because they were inhospitable or less hospitable to human life. In this respect, the eastern end of the Indian Ocean was more in touch with the Indian Ocean, more focused on the Indian Ocean. Interactions in the interior and on the coasts were also very limited. So they were on the same landmass, but they did not communicate and cooperate intensively as you would expect, because the way that we think now is that, a country, right, a contiguous location somewhere, side by side, would cooperate, but that's not the case. So like, for example, the east coast of Malaysia and the west coast of the Malay Peninsula, part of the same peninsula, would have more of a relationship than across the peninsula. In the same way, the east coast of Indonesia, of Sumatra, had more of a relationship with the peninsula across the Straits of Malacca. Cultural and linguistic patterns amongst coastal peoples, as were materials used to make musical instruments and weapons, are also remarkably similar historically for thousands of years. So the sea connects rather than separates in Southeast Asia. And I would argue for the rest of the Indian Ocean as well. And I urge all of us to look at the Indian Ocean as a world unto itself. Thus far as I can see, the Bay of Bengal is treated as a world unto its own as historians, but not so much the rest of the Indian Ocean. The notion of indigeneity also appears in all four papers in various guises. In my book, Fluid Jurisdictions, Colonial Law and Arabs in Southeast Asia, published by Cornell University Press 2 years ago in 2020, I also examined this concept. I would call it more a historical phenomenon rather than a concept, because it was ongoing, changes across time and also across space. The answer to the question, who are the people deemed to be the rightful inhabitants of a certain location, changes over time depending on who's in power. As the British Empire expanded, the concept of natives changed dramatically throughout empire. One would think that the term would apply to several different groups throughout the world, depending on the location. Indeed, this did happen in some cases. But one surprising phenomenon that occurred with remarkable consistency is the restriction of the term natives to South Asians within the British Empire, outside of British India, outside of the Indian subcontinent. This label was especially prominent in the military in the British Indian Army. In my work, I focus on the Strait settlements, which consist of Penang, Malacca, and Singapore, 3 non-contiguous territories along the Straits of Malacca. And it is often confusing for my historical actors when military officers name every single ethnic group within the colony, within the crown colony of the Strait settlements, while every Indian soldier or officer is called a native with a capital N. I note that it is a military classification to differentiate between white British soldiers and the Indian Army, as in the Indians in the Indian Army, in the service of empire throughout the world. But it also affirms the impression that the only true people who were in that place, right, in that place that's outside of the Indian subcontinent, who were rightfully there, were supposed to be Indians. And this occurred throughout empire. This implies that other colonial subjects were not supposed to be there. But British Indians could, and in fact, should be there in the eyes of the British. They were the only legitimate presence throughout empire. So there's this unexpected centrality of British India in empire, and one might say, in the Indian Ocean, looming large, beyond the narratives of resource extraction, which we are more familiar with. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yahaya, for those remarks. And I think really setting us up to think about precisely these categories, like, right, how, in some ways, thinking with the Indian Ocean and thinking the ways that we are doing here helps us think about cartography and about the fact where is proximity, right? The kind of examples that you draw on in your book, and also the relationship between places that may be close by, but are maybe more distant than places that are, across the ocean, and also thinking about specifically the historical changing shifts of categories of what is a native, who is a settler, who is a migrant. And in your work, we see this fascinating way in which both this is a colonial construct, but nonetheless also one that gets taken up by various actors, including the sort of Arab families that you follow across the ocean, some of whom don't ever leave Southeast Asia, but nonetheless are still part of this wider Indian Ocean. So thank you for setting us up, I think, in thinking, and sort of querying some of the ways in which we think about people, place for our conference. And now I invite Professor Qadir for her remarks.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to the conference organizers and the co-panelists today for having me participate in this conversation with you. I am South Asian by birth, Pakistani in particular, but feel that I have a very vexed relationship to the intellectual study of South Asia, even as my work takes that up through the authors that I study, as well as the locations. So let me begin by saying just a little bit about the monograph in progress, and I'll fold in some of my reflections on the paper very, very briefly now, and more detail after the short presentations. So my monograph in progress, Afro-Asian Imaginaries, is an interdisciplinary and multi-sided study that attends to the rich historical and contemporary relationships between Africa and Asian Indian Ocean communities. In particular, I pair 20th and 21st century literary and cultural production like novels, poetry, performance, and visual art with an archival practice that reads against the colonial grain to reveal how Indian Ocean worlds offer us multiple temporalities that provincialize Euro-American modernity as a universal form. This, of course, is a complicated project because largely the materials that I work with are novels, and are novels in the tradition of a British literary culture that, of course, learns from, responds to, complicates the ways that vernacular literary forms of South Asia and Africa intervene, but nevertheless, I'm really aware, despite being a multilingual person, that I've been trained in English departments, and the ways that I study these texts is oriented through that. So in that regard, I'm really grateful for the ways that the papers today prompt me to think across multiple languages, some familiar to me, some not, as well as visual forms such as the photograph and the photography studio through Vindhya Buthpitiya's paper. In particular, though, I do want to think about the work that Anglophone literary critics have to do in this arena of thinking about the Indian Ocean world without overrepresenting the Indian Ocean world as solely a construction of or as a response of British colonialism and imperialism. Toward that specifically, I've been working a little bit more in the Eastern Indian Ocean, and in an article that is coming out later this spring that looks at Kevin Kwan's Rich trilogy and Amitav Ghosh's Ibis trilogy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And in that essay, I'm really trying to think through the points that Professor Yahaya has just brought to our attention, thinking about how the Eastern Indian Ocean, the Malay Archipelago, invite us to think about the ways in which the sea connects us rather than separates us. And so especially with the ways that the polarity of the world is said to be shifting toward Asia as the Asian century, Asia rising, China rising, I think we have a lot of work to do to kind of think about the place of the larger land actors who also have a maritime life, both historically and the present. And in this sense, one of the claims that I try to make in my own work is to think about how histories of Asian wealth accumulation haunt the contemporary, particularly in the ways that Anglophone literary texts today by Asian diasporic writers in Anglophone marketplace really orient us toward logics of inclusion and representation that elide those much more complex, textured, and layered histories that today's papers, and I'm sure the weekend's papers, bring our attention to. What I want to suggest here in specific is that, sorry, I'm just losing my place in my text. If ports like Bombay, Singapore, and Canton have historically entered the narrative frames as critical nodes in these transoceanic voyages that produce global capitalism, as we know it during an intensification of British colonial occupation across the world, then we have to read Anglophone text in relation to a parallel archive of Asian economic activities and strategic complexities with European colonialisms, as I think that the papers today, some of them are showing us through not only an Anglophone archive, but philological attention to languages like Hindustani and their afterlives in Urdu in particular. Scholars who are trained as comparatives, working in multiple languages, address this Anglo-washing of history with a linguistically robust skill set, as we see in the papers today, and they provincialize the Anglophone archive in important ways. Together, though, I think my work contributes to the kind of conversation that we'll have today, away from a singularizing impulse that insists that we refuse easy binaries of land and sea, of colonized and colonizer, of the Asian century versus the British or American century, and against a modality of thinking that positions all colonized figures as subjugated under the same conditions. And so I really look forward to the ways that we can refute binaries and through a much more textured historical and contemporary lens, rethink paths toward a way out of the kind of violent containers of the nation state, particularly ethno-nationalist forms. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Qadir, for those remarks. I think, along with Professor Yahaya, they really set up this panel wonderfully in both pointing to, in your case, the various genres, forms through which we approach this question of transregionalism and places like the Indian Ocean, in particular, thinking about a multilingual archive, thinking about beginning from difference, beginning from plurality, as opposed to beginning from singularity, right? In a way that a certain kind of national literature, national idiom does. And I think the papers today all reflect and work with these tensions of place, emplacement, as well as dispersal and difference. And without sort of further ado, I think at this point, maybe we will now turn to our panelists. So our format is, as I mentioned earlier, we will, they have they have the videos on the website, so they'll be just presenting a short summary of that video of the larger work in progress for many, or larger work. And then we turn back to our discussants for more specific responses to the papers before opening it up to the audience. And I'm delighted to see so many people here, so I'm looking forward to a very robust conversation. So we'll move to our next speaker, Vindhya Buthpitiya.
I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you so much for the wonderful introductory remarks, and I'm looking forward to discussing further. I'm going to offer a very brief overview of my paper, which deals with a lot in terms of its scope. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, but this is extremely condensed. So my paper, Dreaming in Cinestyle, Studio Photography and Transnational Imaginaries in Northern Sri Lanka, offers a glimpse into the small interwoven global worlds of studio photographers as intermediaries of authenticity and possibility, and how they reconcile the desires of their patrons who come into the studios every day with demands of the state to produce identity and other kinds of photographs against a backdrop of conflict-induced displacement and dispersal. I look at the perseverance of these spaces despite the advent of the digital and the proliferation of personal cameras, examining the ways in which they disclose the sort of lasting entanglements of war and everyday photography in northern Sri Lanka. For those of you who may not be aware, Sri Lanka was the site of a civil war from the early 1980s to 2009. And a lot of the post-war period has been marked by continued citizenship grievances, particularly as state violence continues to impact the Sri Lankan Tamil community, particularly in the north and east. So where photography then, in a more conceptual sense, has been understood in terms of contingency and exorbitance, evoking kind of the multiplicity of possibilities and interpretation, enabling what Ariella Azule tells us is an event of photography. I look at the work of studios, especially the persistence of the seemingly dated artifact of a studio backdrop, which features quite prominently in the paper. So these are sort of big canvases painted with quite fantastical sceneries that are used as the backdrop for studio portraits. And I look at how within this sort of world of the studio, photographers act as arbiters of various types of everyday aspirations for the patrons of the studio as they relate to questions of mobility and movement, but also deterritorialization in terms of the Sri Lankan Tamil community as a national community fragmented by war, but also the assumption of new identities, notably desires for migration, as well as achieving new citizenships, where the Tamil community, as I said, have been hampered by impairments and inequities of citizenship in the post-war. So studios, as a consequence, have also become further entangled with the state and border actors as the expanding security apparatus of border regimes of generating new kinds of photographies and biometric information become entangled with everyday photographic practice. And this is obviously linked to the idea of how these border actors and state actors also appropriate the labor and work of studio photographers in authenticating personhoods and citizenships, as well as relationships, through not only things like national identity cards and passport headshots, but also things like the making of wedding albums and wedding portraits and things like that, where people have to kind of offer proof of relationships in kind of a host of unconventional ways. So I think about these practices, or kind of myriad practices, to give shape to this almost simultaneous visualization of memory and prophecy, hinting importantly at an essential and ever-present possibility of and for movement. So I hope that's a decent enough summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buthpitiya. We now turn to our next speaker, Dr. Uttara Shahani, who's at the University of Oxford.
Can you hear me? So, my paper, I'm going to try sharing as my screen because I do have some images. Wasn't going to share, but I think I should. Am I sharing the screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so my paper is fairly descriptive. It's just, I think, to draw attention to a particular type of immobility that happened at Partition, and focusing on the region of Sindh, which doesn't feature so much in Partition histories because it was a territory like Punjab or Bengal, but nonetheless witnessed a large-scale movement both out of the province and into the province. Scholars, when speaking of partition, have usually this movement, as you see, arrows going across borders, and it sometimes sort of falls in largely into this Hindu-Muslim binary. India and Muslims going to Pakistan. But that's not all, and there's great work on how both India and Pakistan are outside of Punjab, for which they agree an exchange of population because of the sheer scale of violence there, try to stop further migrations because they just can't cope with, or they say they can't cope with any more refugees. So Pakistan doesn't want any more Muslim refugees or any more refugees. India doesn't want any more Hindu refugees. And they try to stop what are called evacuees at the time from coming back after evacuee property becomes a problem. So in general, the scholarship, it's very good, has focused on the introduction of permits to prevent any further entry into India and Pakistan. But I want to draw attention to something which is more the prevention of exit, which is, in the first case, they introduced these permits to stop people moving across borders, and they deny evacuees return. And this is a very internally differentiated system as well, based on religion and caste. But there is the prevention of exit works particularly effectively when it comes to caste. So in the province of Sindh, when the what I talk about is when the capitalist Hindus, it's the home of a trading diaspora. We're talking about the Indian Ocean, and these Sindhis have been, Claude Markowitz's work, have trading networks all over the world and remit significant, and they're bankers and traders, and the Sindh government tries to stop them from leaving by imposing all sorts of laws, and to mainly to freeze assets and to acquire their property. They're scared that the economic system will collapse, and let's not forget that at this time Karachi, which is the capital of Sindh, becomes the capital of Pakistan. So there's tension at two levels, both at the provincial government level and at the central government level. However, these with mobility capital and quite literally capital managed to leave after getting the Indian government to intervene on their behalf and send ships, and they carry out a whole year's worth of campaigning. And after the January riots of 1948, the Indian government starts sending ships, and they go, and the Indian government intervenes on their behalf. But Pakistan government then passes the Essential Services Maintenance Ordinance, which does affect this capitalist class, but it mainly affects and this law is still in place in South Asia, I think in all South Asian countries, in forcing labor to go back to work. At this time, it was used specifically to stop people from of the oppressed castes from crossing the border. This is a casteist cartoon, which I didn't put in my original video. Comfortable that R.K. Lakshman, who an upper caste Indian cartoonist, makes of at around that time. It's not dated. Or Muhammad Ayub Khurro, who is the chief minister of Sindh at the time, holding Dalits in a pen almost with their animals and their brooms. So, and the Indian government at this time then decides that it's not really going to do anything to help, although a lot of sweepers and sanitation workers are writing frantic letters. I've read them, some of them are in Gujarati and Kathiawadi, to the Indian government saying, evacuate us, we're being arrested, we're being tortured, please do something to, I've used one example here. The government says, no, we've got to rehabilitate the refugees that are already here. So basically the ones who are richer and higher up in the caste hierarchy, and then decides that they're going to adopt a policy of, in quotes, infiltration. So they're going to allow oppressed caste refugees to infiltrate, so basically become across the border, basically occupy the category of illegal migrants over time. So, which makes their position all the more precarious. I think I'll stop there now because I could go on, but I think that's the paper in summary. And I have at the end included an example of this sort of a law working in Kashmir, preventing up to this current day, enacted at the same time as these laws were enacted in Sindh, but preventing people who would like to go to Pakistani side, to the Azad Kashmir side, using an anti-egress law to hold them in Indian occupied Kashmir. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So our final panelist for this panel is Haider Shahbaz of UCLA.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, to all the organizers, to all the panelists and the other participants, and the faculty discussants. I'm just gonna present like a brief summary of the presentation, but I'll be happy to expand on any of this in the question and answer sessions as well. So in my presentation, Racism and the Colonial Beginnings of Modern Urdu Prose, I focus on the work of John Borthwick Gilchrist, a colonial linguist, and a view of Afro-Asian relations premised on anti-Black racism, which undergirds his work and the work of other British philologists in 18th century India. Gilchrist, first professor of Hindustani at Fort William College in Calcutta, gives the following entry for dark in his A Dictionary, English and Hindustani, which was published between 1787 and 1790. And it's one of the first modern dictionaries of Hindustani that kind of treats Urdu and Hindi as separate languages. But this is the entry he gives for dark. He says, ignorant, jahil or nadan, and gloomy, of surda and udas. The association of darkness with derogatory human qualities does not come as a surprise, Gilchrist, in his various philological and lexical writings, repeatedly refers to Black people as civilizational inferiors. Apart from compiling the first modern dictionary for Urdu, when Gilchrist assumed his post as professor of Hindustani, he also supervised the publication of translated Urdu fictions to be used as textbooks for British officials, such as the Oriental tale Bago Bahar, which contains many explicit instances of anti-Black racism. The importance of these modern Urdu prose fictions published at Fort William College cannot be understated. These same translated fictions became the foundation of modern Urdu prose and were used as pedagogical text for the general audience in India as well, not just British colonial officials. And they continue to be taught in schools today as the canon of modern Urdu fiction. Bago Bahar, for example, has never gone out of print since its publication in 1801. In my presentation, I place Gilchrist's biography within a context of global British imperial expansion and racial capitalism. For example, he visited and wrote poetry in Grenada as a young man, and he specifically talks about the enslavement of Africans there. He studied language in India, but he also cultivated indigo and opium, and he consistently talks about how his lexical writings were a way for him to enrich himself. And he also expropriated land in Australia. He was one of the earliest buyers of land in New South Wales, and made a small fortune out of this investment in Australia. I also place his linguistic work in a context of Orientalist philology at the Asiatic Society of Bengal in the late 18th century that created a racist temporal schema that worked in accordance with linguistic, moral, developmental, civilizational, and geographical schemes to create a hierarchy where Black Africans were placed at the bottom, white Europeans at the top, and the Indians were supposedly occupying an unstable middle position between the Black past and white future. And the consequences of this kind of temporalized racial schemas are many and really profound in some ways. I think they continue to shape a lot of post-colonial relations, and even within India, these ideas of the many Indian philologists taking on these ideas of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in the 20th century and in the 19th century wrote about, for example, the differences between Muslims or Hindu, or the differences between North Indians and South Indians. Other people have also talked about how caste is interconstituted with race in these scenarios, but also beyond just the domestic relations within South Asia, they also shaped relations with Africans and Afro-Asian relations more generally. And I hope that this work contributes in some small way towards the understanding of the co-constitution of Orientalism and anti-Black racism in modern Urdu prose, and also points towards the urgent need for post-colonial and Black studies scholars, Indian Ocean and Atlantic Ocean studies scholars, to talk to and learn from each other. We must collectively reject the racial schemes of British philology and turn towards the possibility of a future Afro-Asia premised on anti-colonial struggle against white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal values. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Haider, and thank you to all our panelists for the presentations, and those of you who are joining us. Again, if you haven't had the opportunity, I would really suggest looking at the videos and for the longer presentations at this point. And part of the reason why we chose this format was to really allow for a robust set of discussions. And at this point, I turn over to now our faculty discussants, who will be responding to these papers before opening it up to questions. If you have, for members of the audience, if you would like, please feel free to add your questions in the chat, and I'm happy to sort of moderate from there. All right, so thank you again to our faculty discussants, and I leave it in your capable hands.
Thank you very much for 4 excellent papers. While all the papers were on South Asia, the papers deal with interiority and exteriority of places along the Indian Ocean, linking the core region of this conference, which is of course South Asia, to adjacent regions, West, namely East Africa and the Middle East, and not so much East. As a historian, I would like to widen the aperture to encompass as much of the region as possible. In my remarks, I will speak on three major phenomena: the concept of invitation and hospitality, historical contingency, and borders. In his paper, Languages of Land and Sea, Urdu's Philology 1930 Response to Colonial Ethno-Linguistics, Vipin Krishna examines Pakistani historian and philologist Syed Sulaiman Naqvi's book. A major thrust of Naqvi's argument is that Indian Muslims should be considered part of the subcontinent as well. In particular, Naqvi underscores the Arab native connection, to use Krishna's words, to India, not least because of the prominence of Sri Lanka, formerly known as Sarandip, also known as Adam's Peak. Could also talk about these sort of multiple names for the same place across the Indian Ocean. Krishna shows, I'll refer to everyone by their last names. Krishna shows the limitations of Western philology in the study of languages on the subcontinent, especially when he tells us how neither Persian, Arabic, or Urdu philology had much use for the concept of stock, which means common familial descent. And we can definitely extend this schema to other areas of life, such as biological lineages, genealogies, and so on. Krishna writes on page 5, if the archive of commonly used words studied through philology in the 1910s and 1920s had bolstered the idea of Hindu-Hindi ethno-nationalism, Naqvi's aim was to try and widen this idea of the ethnos through a philological study and to try and include non-landed oceanic regions within this imagination. As a historian of a region where material culture to do with the early history of the pre-colonial period, such as during the period of the coming of Islam to the region, during this period, material culture is severely lacking, leading to much frustration among scholars. So I very much relate to this, to this paper. I was struck by the mention of apocrypha, folkloric connections, and sense, as in smells, which jump out at me in this paper. It made me wish that these words are not stigmatized in the study of history, for they provide really sound evidence for historical connections amongst people who did not keep paper records that last to this day. Indeed, these sources remain resilient proof of long-lasting links amongst people today in the region. The very best histories are based on these sources, in fact, pushing the boundaries of historical research. A major foundational article important in the field of the history of the Indian Ocean is based largely on sense. Michael Feener and Michael Lafan's article, Sufi Sense Across the Indian Ocean, Yemeni Hagiography and the Earliest History of Southeast Asian Islam, is what I find to be a very creative study. And unfortunately, after they wrote this article, no one else has taken them up on the suggestion to look for sources, unexpected sources, such as smells. It is a very creative study, where they follow a Yemeni merchant who searched for fragrant wood in Southeast Asia. And it's actually found it all over Southeast Asia, from Philippines to Thailand to Sumatra in Indonesia, to add to incense, which has become popular in Arabia and East Africa. So there was a hunger for this wood, which is very fragrant. It has become really popular in the Middle East, and it is from Southeast Asia. In keeping with this metaphor by Michaels, Feener, and Lafan, we should be very much at home with simply suggesting the plausible in 50, when we look at the more remote period. And by this, I mean, it is relative, like what's remote for us, for me might not be remote for you, in terms of access to sources. So they suggested the plausible in 15th century Indian Ocean with scant other material to refer to. Languages flow organically, and that's why we talk about language branches, linguistic trees, and so on. But the study of linguistics, and to a great extent philology, over time has constructed borders around family trees, such as scholars now talk about language having in Krishna's words, having a certain tolerance for borrowing words from each other. But Krishna's paper shows that that is not how language works at all. So this calls for a more explicit reworking of how we should approach the study of languages in the Indian Ocean, because it is clearly inadequate, as your paper shows. Perhaps we should make more concerted efforts to break out of our own disciplinary conventions dictated thus far by European and Anglo-American schemes, because the regions that we study do not really fit existing dominant schema. The term tolerance implies that there was resistance and that something was sacrificed in incorporating words into one's speech and writing. The same goes for the term loan words, used especially when talking about world languages, another problematic term which should be scrutinized. It implies that some languages are stable worlds as compared to others, authoritative but also secure enough to include foreign words temporarily, as if these words are going to be returned at some point, which is of course ridiculous. It's not like people decide, okay, now we're going to retire these words, it's not ours. Ironically, loaded terms which has entered the English language like thug, juggernaut, and gung-ho are still very much in use today despite racial connotations and origins in empire. I appreciate how the paper, actually all the four papers, pay very careful attention to historical contingency. Krishna quotes Nurfadzilah towards the end of his paper, who wrote that wherever Muslims went, through religious, commercial, and epistemological needs, introduced their words into the languages of the country. Here, I would like to call for a clearer separation between two phenomena, linguistics and philology, which you speak about in your paper. Both should be historically contextualized, but they are separate because the latter reflects on the former, of course, but has its own dynamics. And in looking at Nurfadzilah, Krishna notes that as a philologist, he must not be evaluated against standards of right and wrong. In fact, his writing should be a mirror to the world around him. In Vindhya Buthpitiya's paper, Dreaming the Cinestyle, the visual aspect of reflection is taken more literally as she explores the events of photography, to use a term by Ariel Azoulay, whom she cites. Buthpitiya illustrates Azoulay's concept of photography and potential history, as she says, framed visions do not imprison, but instead serve as a focal point for its perceived potentials for mediating between past, present, and future. Specifically, she brings out the tension between mobility and stillness. Moments of stillness are valued more against background of turmoil. She says, this is an extreme environment, right? This extreme setting due to ongoing war and violence. In the midst of conflict, displacement, and dispersal in Sri Lanka, there is immobility that is captured by the camera. But here I want to complicate this notion of mobility, because when people are forced to move due to war, due to something that's external to them, that's artificially made, is that really mobility? And this, is something that runs through the entire panel. Like all the panelists talk about mobility and immobility, but sometimes the mobility is not really mobility. It's forced migration. Becoming a refugee, is that considered mobility? I mean, of course, the person moves literally, but they are being forced to do so. So, there's something for us to think about. I would like to touch upon this notion of hospitality and access, which you write about. On page 3, you wrote, beyond the antechambers, where apprentices busily slip photographs into stamped envelopes, we are summoned to wonder how we might fashion our unfolding present ourselves to be realized into future photographic selves by the camera. Slender dressing tables radiated with sandalwood talcum and neon plastic combs beckon to us to spruce ourselves up for the occasion. Offerings of men's clothing taking the shape of polyester ties and rayon coats pinned to the walls entice us to assume new identities, unquote. Words like summoned, offerings, beckon, entice really make it seem like photography studios are huge on hospitality. Indeed, studio interiors often mimic that of homes. So this is not surprising. You know, it's not just any home, but like a cozy home, right? Aesthetically beautiful, very welcoming, cozy and stuff like that. One should also look at how these photographs are key in being mementos for families, especially for people who are forced to flee their homeland and also leave their families behind due to violence enacted against them. So in that sense, you know, I'm not surprised by this sort of language. I just want you to make it more explicit that it's like entering a home, right? When you enter an old-fashioned photography studio. And also I note the pun, you know, I guess unexpected, unintended pun of you know, camera chambers and stuff like that, right? This Latin is camera, you know, so there's that as well. So you know, there's something could be made of that perhaps. So this sort of home, artificial home constructed in the studio sensitizes us to the fact that photographs themselves produced by the studios invite us to look at them, to gaze upon them, and to appreciate them. So this is something peculiar to post photographs, as opposed to photographs taken, say, by a photojournalist taking candid shots of something, right? There's this notion of transgression as we look at those, right? But less so in post photographs where we assume people want to be seen. I have a question, which is, what is the role of nostalgia in photography in general? Not just in Sri Lanka, but across the world, I see this phenomenon that you describe in your paper. Why do people hold on to old schemata and conventions to this extent in photography, especially right down to the way that people pose in these photographs, right? Reminiscent of portraiture, as you pointed out. True, as you said, it allows us to momentarily evade the humdrum logics of self, time, and geography in the search for a fantastical elsewhere, escapism in various ways. As anthropologists and historians, we discipline ourselves to interpret photographs in this way, but the photographs you described are steeped in nostalgia because many people took photos in a style that's from the past. It's a thing. It's still a thing now, and we see it in the, you know, not so much in the pose and stuff like that, but in filters, right, on social media, where, you know, the most popular filters are usually the old-timey ones, you know, the retro ones. So you describe how interiors of photography studios are often dated and dimly lit, even when their exteriors advertise the latest technology, say, of digital cameras. And this is commonly found throughout the world and something that we should consider. Indeed, the current obsession in nostalgia in photography is very interesting. I ask this question not just because the phenomenon is widespread, right? This popularity of old-timey filters and stuff like that, but also for intellectual reasons, because it helps for us to contextualize how material culture associated with past historical periods has been co-opted by people living in later periods. What sort of historical epochs were celebrated and whose? On page 4, you stated these backdrops that studios use portrayed a perhaps dated sensibility of material wealth, made up of Palladian windows, Roman arches, fluted columns, and you know, that hinted at a Western colonial capriccio, unquote. So as you said, it's escapism on both axes of time and space. But also, we must consider why this era. Palladianism was an architectural style fashionable in Britain between 1750 and 1760, but it did not emerge in Britain, obviously. It emerged in Italy much earlier, about two centuries prior, and became very popular in Britain. And then this style was exported throughout empire. So this framing that you speak of, it happened again and again in the past through various iterations, just like how Nadvi's philology in Krishna's paper should be contextualized as a source to tell us about how Nadvi thought of linguistic flows We should also be sensitive to artistic trends in architecture, portraiture, illustrations, and so on. The key phrase here that you use is dated sensibility, which means that we are already making a judgment, right? That it's from the past, it's not au courant or being current for the time. That's what you're saying. So this impulse should also be questioned, right? The fact that we judge them like, oh, this is a bit gauche, or this is out of place, or this is funny, or something like that. The question, why that framing, why that mise-en-scène, why that aesthetic historical trend? To what end? It opens up a new dimension, I think, in your research. You stated in your paper, studios still using backdrops like these had a single vendor that had been in the business of malleable elsewhere for over 60 years. I think it's worthwhile to investigate why certain elsewheres are more malleable than others. Uttara Shahani's paper on caste partition and the prevention of exit examines the mobility regime in post-partition Sindh. Shahani states that Sindh is an often disregarded province in histories of partition because it remained undivided at partition and did not witness the scale of genocidal violence unfolding in Punjab. So again, this also sensitizes us to how we think about the world, mobility versus immobility. Violence over here seems less than over there because over there there's more mobility and stuff like that, right? So all these things are dictate our understandings of what is violence, what is mobility, and so on and so forth. Her research shows that one can indeed be mobile without moving, usually through the transformation of racial categories. Since partition was a deterritorialized and demographic one, she says, a horror no less. Labor and capital were retooled and redirected after partition, and oppressed castes bore the brunt of inequality. The history of post-partition Sindh makes us recall how prior to this event, the partition, this phenomenon of violence in immobility was the far more common phenomenon experienced by people under colonial rule throughout the world for a long time, rather than the act of being physically cast out. So Shahani's work sensitizes us to this longer phenomenon, and we could historicize this particular event, right, this particular phenomenon that happened in Sindh we could open it up, right, and trace it from the colonial period onwards. Shahani's paper makes me think of the work of Yael Berda and Kalyani Ramnath. Berda's book traces how Israel's permit regime for Palestinians is one of the world's most extreme and complex apparatuses for population management. And each chapter, she analyzes one aspect of it. And I think it provides a good point of comparison for a more complete history of bureaucracy when it comes to the aftermath of partition in Sindh specifically, because it seems like that's where the action is at, right? Yeah. Ramnath looks in particular at South Indian refugees in the Bay of Bengal in the work of the Second World War. So this would form good points of comparison for your own research. The unofficial policy of allowing infiltration along the border, which you mentioned on page 7, is particularly interesting and could be approached from many angles. I would be interested to see how cattle was instrumentalized in particular. Like how did they, they didn't succeed in the end, as you said, but I would like to see what kinds of language was associated with the instrumentalization of cattle as a means for people to be able to move, so yeah. A finely grained study on how the Indian government act undercover, right, as you say, allowing oppressed caste refugees to move without committing to an official evacuation program is a rich site of research potentially, because it opens up to cases of not so savory cases of blackmail and things like that. So I would like to see a more focused view on the ground. Haider Shahbaz's paper tackles new racial structures and hierarchies introduced by colonialism. Organic flows of information and knowledge quickened under colonialism or intensified across the Indian Ocean as completely new hierarchies came into being. Colonial encounters were skewed in terms of power. The phenomenon of empire is a scale for scholars to reckon with always. No colony exists in isolation. There's always something else going on. All colonies are implicated in everything that one colony experiences. Not only are how new racial hierarchies constructed, but they're also constructed on a much larger scale, involving more people with more diverse peoples in other areas, being compelled to be compared to one another all of a sudden. It's not that people did not meet, but now people met within very rigid and unjust structures of colonialism, as described by Shahbaz. Knowledge was implicated in this, including that of languages, of course. Shahbaz also states, imperial language is a racist language of command. Indeed, it was on a very basic level, like literally. One doesn't even need to look at philology or hypothetical equivalents for this, which you mentioned, citing Lydia Liu. Apart from dictionaries, we should also look at handbooks and language manuals. The manuals that I saw, the language manuals that I saw in Arabic, Malay, and Chinese, to English and Dutch, produced for the consumption of the British and Dutch governments, depicted very specific situations accompanied by illustrations that portray the white man as superior. The white man, it will be a cartoon, you know, and the white man is always sitting in a chair, and the colonial subject is always on the floor or something like that. Or the white man will be sitting, white woman be sitting in a trishaw and palanquin, and the Dutch colonial, the colonial subjects will be lower, of course. So illustrations also play a part. So these books, right, these language manuals, unlike dictionaries, do not aspire to be exhaustive, as they cater to the practical colonial bureaucrat who simply want to get by in their daily lives. So expressions such as, drive straight, chauffeur, or fetch me from my office, or be quiet, send me lunch at 12, let me pass, were translated into local languages and always expressed in the imperative. They are not language manuals as such, but vocabularies of rule. All right, so that's all. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Then now we turn to Professor Qadir.
Thank you. The papers in this session have offered us such a tremendous breadth of expertise on sites across South Asia, and I'm particularly struck by the methodological range on offer for our discussion in this session. So I'll begin by pointing to some through lines that I see across the paper before moving into specific reflections and questions for each panelist. Mobilities, of course, finds meaningful presence in each paper. The relationship between human travel and commodity exchange, language flows and the global transit of colonial figures, the frictions of forced or coerced mobility and immobility, as well as imagined and aspirational mobilities through artifacts that fix movement. The papers also point us at times toward quotidian objects and practices that help us understand how the macro structures of the state, whether British colonial or post-colonial South Asia, shape the socio-political lives of everyday people. There's also a concern with dating, origins, or perhaps better said, a concern with historicity. In Uttara Shahini's paper, we're asked to reckon with the legacies of colonial era ordinances deployed by the post-colonial state in the immediate aftermath of Pakistan's independence, particularly with attention to how caste oppressed communities experienced partition in Sindh. And the still persistent afterlives of such ordinances in the contemporary context of Kashmir, where immobility is enforced in differently gendered ways. In Vindhya Buthpitiya's talk, I'm awed by how she peels back the sedimentations of materiality, as well as the former layers of the photography studio and the studio photograph. She draws our attention both to the techniques of composition and framing for local elites at the turn of the 20th century and the hand-me-down backgrounds used by a third-generation photographer. As she puts it, quote, such mixed media practices amounted to the persistence of older schemata and conventions, end quote. And indeed, even as digital photography and editing displace some of the analog forms, I'm intrigued by the endurance of the infrastructure of the physical studio, as well as its place in facilitating the aspirations of its clientele. Vipin Krishna's paper so carefully takes us across a tremendous time span from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century by attending to Syed Suleiman Nadvi's work across myriad textual forms, such as travelogues and maps, using both histories of traffic across the Indian Ocean and their narrative forms to problematize colonial epistemes that have positioned India and Arabia as, quote, linguistically isolated regions. In Haider Shahbaz's talk, we're asked to rethink the forms of Afro-Asian relation, particularly when attending to structures of racialization. Shahbaz prompts us to word this through the case of the British colonial philologist John Porthwick Gilchrist, and thus we move from the time of Gilchrist's life in the late 18th and early 19th century to the early and mid 20th century. I'm especially curious on how positioning Gilchrist's work on Hindustani helps us to revision how South Asians are socialized into anti-Blackness, not only through the encounters between indentured South Asians in British colonial Kenya, which you mentioned, but also within the South Asian subcontinent and in its so-called vernacular languages. Throughout my listening and reading of these papers, I'm impressed with how carefully each of you has prompted us to think about the relevance of your research questions to our current events. With these broad connections in mind, let me turn now to specific questions for panelists, with of course open invitations to situate your remarks today within your larger projects or your research questions and their scholarly agendas. So Vipin, I'll just list all the questions and I'm happy to email these to people if you would like. What's at stake for Nadvi and for us in interrupting strictly terrestrial notions of ethnos? I'm eager for you to link this perhaps to the impact of the 1870 revenue crisis that you mentioned and the kinds of studies that it prompted. I listened kind of incredulously as you told us that casts off oceans, and I'm curious about what the implications of foregrounding oceans would have held in his time and how we might still continue to think with that. You also say that Nadvi's approach to philology is a, quote, mirror to the world around him, end quote. And I wonder if you'd expand on this point. While mirrors do offer us reflections, there is an inversion in the image. And I'm wondering if the sensibility of inversion, in addition to reflection, have resonances for your work. Haider, I really appreciate the ways in which you insist on reading dictionaries and grammar not only as technical texts and remind us about the constitutive interplay between Orientalisms and racisms. Your focus on Gilchrist, who seems to be an imperial subject par excellence, a beneficiary of the Jadoo of the colonies, both in his transits from Edinburgh to colonial Guyana and colonial India, as well as the ways in which he has hands in commodity production, land acquisition, and settler colonial context, even as he, the settler himself, is absent from New South Wales. With this in mind, I want to ask you to tease out the ways that you're thinking about racial formation across the racialized geographies of British colonialism. You draw on Lydia Liu's work to talk about the forms of translational equivalence that are produced by things like bilingual dictionaries. So I'm wondering about different specificities based on their geohistories of Blacknesses. I'm curious about this, especially because there are African diasporas in South Asia that predate British colonialism across the Indian Ocean world. And I'm wondering how Sidi or Shidi communities in South Asia shape or do not shape ideas of Blacknesses when set alongside the kind of racializing work done by a figure like Gilchrist and others. Additionally, how might somebody like Joginder Paul, with whom you begin your remarks, who lived in Kenya and supported its anti-colonial movement, influence rearticulations of Afro-Asian relations, one that might seek to repair the violences of anti-Blackness? I would also love to hear any reflections on the Shazia Sikandar painting with which you ended your remarks, and if that might speak to either of the other questions. Vindhya, the idea of potentiality permeates your paper, the aspirations of mobility, whether social or physical, and how they're often conjoined. I'm particularly interested in how you might think of visuality and its traffics as a form of reterritorializing, a modality of reterritorializing that unfolds in parallel relation to the transnational dispersal of Tamil communities, especially as you point out in Europe, North America, and Australia. I'm also curious to hear more from you on how you would theorize the relationship between what you called identity photography, which I take to be something imposed on a particular subject, possibly a carceral form in its relation to surveillance, alongside the forms of photography that produce identification in the context of affiliation of self and community making. Uttara, your paper so usefully problematizes ideas of peace ascribed to Sindhi communities at the time of Pakistan and India's independence, as well as histories of partition. I want to invite you to say more about the forms of violence as well. Early in your talk, you pose a distinction between, quote, extraordinary or, quote, serious violence, which I understand to be violence perpetrated by state actors against a kind of mobility capital that was accessible to the Hindu elite, including bankers, merchants, and traders, as you mentioned. And so a kind of insulation from that kind of state violence potentially. Are there ways that the boundaries between this group of mobile capital and state violence are more porous than they might readily seem apparent? To elaborate on that just a bit, I want us to turn to your example of agriculturalists whom you discuss as themselves able to move within their seasonal circuits, but their cattle being disallowed from that movement. I guess I'm trying to stay with the idea of how property in this case is being immobilized in relation to or in juxtaposition with ways in which you theorize mobile capital earlier on. As you ask us to think about immobility as a crucial component of a history that has overrepresented mobility, even when forced or coerced, I'm reminded of the work of the feminist political theorist and mobility studies scholar, Martha Balaguerra, whose work focuses on migration between Central and North America, and particularly migrations of trans women, who she calls chicas trans in her work. Balaguer gives us this heuristic of confinement in motion as a, quote, carceral regime of sovereignty beyond the walls of prison, or as she writes, how confinement multiplies in everyday life beyond explicitly carceral facilities. I wonder if this is a useful interlocution for you, especially as you turn toward thinking about the contemporary resonances of these questions in the case of enforced immobility of Pakistani women in Kashmir more recently. Thank you all for allowing me to think with you.
Thank you, Professor Qadir, and thank you, Professor Yahaya, for these wonderful comments that, I think really highlight both the sort of granular details in each of these papers with the attention paid to specific cases while tying them to many of the broader themes of our conference. So I want to give some time to our panelists to respond to specific questions or more generally to the discussants before opening it up for questions. So I guess at this point, the floor is yours, panelists, and feel free in whatever order you'd like to respond.
Thank you so much both for the comments. I really appreciate it. I'm going to respond more generally so that everyone has time to speak, and I'm happy to kind of discuss later. I think the first thing around, just to touch on the question around mobility or the observation around mobility, is that there are two kinds of movement that are happening out of Sri Lanka. There's obviously the kind of direct violence relating to forced displacement, migration, but there's also the kind of voluntary seems too harsh a word, but or too absolute a term, the kind of migration that comes out of impairments to citizenship, where people feel like their literal kind of socioeconomic mobility is hampered because of their kind of identity belonging to a minority group that isn't favored by the state, right? So there is a desire for mobility there that's not necessarily forced movement in that sense. And the other kind of side to this, which I think ties into what Neelofer asked around self-identification, I think the identification one is interesting because it ties into a lot of existing kind of photographic theory around photography not really having an identity because it exists to serve ideology and the state, etc. While as the kind of Azalean proposition is the opposite of that, which says that photography has power beyond what the state ascribes to it. And I think this is where it becomes interesting because even the images that are produced as identity photography, so like national identity cards or passports, etc., are very readily appropriated, manipulated, not just by the makers, so the studio photographers themselves who know how to manipulate the system. So if you think about, for example, the ways in which wedding photographs are staged in order to satiate border officials who will then believe that a given relationship is quote unquote real. Or similarly, the ways in which very kind of plain, mundane identity, national identity card headshots, for example, the way in which they're appropriated not just into everyday registers of like, you know, passing hands exchange between friends and family, but also the ways in which they are used very widely in political protest, which is the kind of other side of my work. This is obviously the nicer stuff to do with the more hopeful spaces of studios. So it's to say that there's a kind of instability that informs a lot of these categories, which is why I worked with types of images rather than necessarily in the kind of formal specific sense in the way that maybe art historians do. So I think there's a lot of interesting tension there between the kind of violent simplification, to use David Graeber's words, of these bureaucratic processes of identification versus also this idea of self-presentation, which is to do with the more kind of fantastical and the more kind of aspirational that is framed in the studio, and how these images move between these registers precisely because of the ways in which they're used. So I hope that kind of generally summarizes some of it. There's also a comment on the backdrop, but I will maybe answer that off the record if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Uttara, would you?
Yeah, I mean, it's me, right? So, thanks very much to both discussants for their very useful comments. I'll also try and answer them in a group. I mean, both brought up the cattle. Yes, I mean, the question of peace in Sindh, it's a very, Zamindar, I think, has talked about it a bit, and it's a very contingent piece. It's, and the porosity between capital and state violence, I think, I mean, I don't know if I've understood you rightly, but it takes different forms. You have these capitalists like J.B. Mangaram, who's the owner of Britannia Biscuits, which is, you know, a big biscuit factory in Asia at that time, and writing to Gandhi and saying that, you know, middle class poor traders are being squeezed because there's a stoppage of money and the circulation of our goods, because, you know, they send their goods to agents all over the country. And they're trying to stop us from going, and but actually it's this stoppage of capital, it's this state violence, he does frame it as a sort of state violence, is making the capitalists leave. So it's, and the Sindh Congress representative also writes at that time that actually it's the control of capital that's triggering migration, attempted control of capital by the both the Sindh government and the Pakistani state, which is forcing this migration. So it's got a circular relationship. This is how they see it. And yes, I mean, the instrumentalization of cattle at this time, it does fall into, I mean, Joya Chatterjee's talked about this, about property, about these laws, the evacuee property laws framing forms of minority citizenship in India and Pakistan at this time, and what she calls partial citizenship. But I think we can go even before the evacuee property laws come into force. I think Sindh is almost like a testing field for implement these forms of extractive sovereignty and these sort of ambiguous relationships with minority communities, that you belong and you don't belong, and so you're excluded and you're not included. And I think cattle does fall into that larger sort of rubric of trying to control, in a way, trying to control migration through property. But I do need to look at it more deeply, and perhaps because a lot of migrations from this region took place later than my temporal sort of, because there are ongoing migrations from Tharparkar region to the Indian side of the border now, and there are similar. And I think the person who's sort of better equipped, and I'm hoping to work with her on this question, is Natasha Raheja, who works on later migrations and caste affecting them, because Tharparkar has the largest sort of Hindu, I'm using Hindu in quotes, minorities and also oppressed caste minorities still there in infiltration also. I didn't get into it because of reasons of space. It also intersects with the question of conversion. The Indian government suddenly wakes up to, really has this jolt that we should do something more concrete for these people wishing to evacuate if there's a threat of religious conversion. So you have oppressed tribes like Bhils and others writing to them and saying, we will be forcibly converted to Islam if you don't evacuate us soon. And then suddenly there's a flurry of letters in the Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of Transport saying, oh, we must do something, but they don't do anything. And so I need to develop this idea of infiltration more and what it actually means. There's this one aspect of conversion which I haven't gone into. Thinking of Palestine and Israel, I am in fact working with a historian of Palestine, Dr. Anir Fan, to do a comparative project on immobility at the time of partition, both South Asia and Palestine. So I'm hoping to put this in dialogue with scholarship on that region as well. I think, yes, definitely. I need to historicize it further. I didn't because of lack of space. Carceral regimes in outside of prisons. That's definitely very helpful thinking about Kashmiri Pakistani women who aren't allowed to return in the current, in the contemporary scenario. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you. Now we'll turn quickly to Haider, and then I notice we have a question for, I think, all of our panelists, including our discussants, from Kelvin in the chat. And then we can also, if there are other questions, feel free to add them to the chat or raise your hand, and I can unmute you. So Haider.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments and questions. I really appreciate that. And Professor Yahaya, I really like that you kind of focused on this importance of transcolonial work, and I think this is something that doesn't happen a lot because our current knowledge formations are so dependent on area studies and ideas of fields and geographies, which in themselves are kind of related to these racialized dimensions of knowledge from the 18th century philology. So, I think it's very important to think about how these knowledge formations in one colony are dependent on what's happening in other colonies. Thank you for that. And for pointing out how these manuals are kind of vocabularies of rule. And I do intend to look at more work by Gilchrist because you're right that a lot of this technical work is very specifically for these British colonial officers. So other than dictionaries, he did produce grammars, he did produce, even abridged versions of his dictionaries, which were specifically targeted for British colonial officers who don't have the time to really learn Urdu properly. So yeah, it's interesting to hear about these examples in other languages and areas as well, but that definitely happens with Gilchrist as well. And Professor Qadir, thank you so much for your engagement. My own work I've learned so much from your work in my own research. So it's really quite both exciting and unnerving to be getting your comments on this. But I think you pointed out two areas that I really wish I had time to kind of expand on more. One, which is about the kind of existing history of Afro-Asian relations in South Asia before the British colonizers, right? So there are African populations in India already, right? And they're often known as Habshis or Shidis, and there's mentions of them in Urdu literature before British colonialism. And I also want to make clear that these histories and relations are not always very hospitable or reciprocal. There is also a history of anti-Black racism in South Asia that precedes British colonialism. So my point is not that the British invented racism, but just that it was a different configuration, and especially this kind of temporal developmental schema where civilizations kind of progressed according to different times. I want to focus on why that became such an important dimension of this racialization under British colonialism. But, one of the interesting things about Gilchrist's work, or about the work of these British philologists at that time, as you kind of alluded, is precisely that they completely ignore this African population in South Asia and this history of Afro-Asian relations. They don't really talk about it. So it kind of works through, I think, two procedures. One is just straight erasure, in the sense that they just don't talk about this history, these relations, these contemporary relations. And part of that is because in their mind, Asia and Africa, and especially their languages and knowledges, are really classical or ancient. So they really think of Asia and Africa in terms of civilizational decay, as regions and people that were once important, for example, when they spoke Sanskrit, or when the pharaohs were in Africa, and have since kind of decayed or regressed in civilizational terms. So they don't really think about contemporary relations. They're always thinking about Africa and Asia and their relations in terms of ancient languages and classical relations. So there is a kind of erasure of this Afro-Asian interaction that you talk about. And the second procedure that happens is that of equivalence, where they create kind of translational equivalence between different ideas of Blackness. So, I mean, Felicity Nussbaum has, for example, talked about this in the context of Europe, how Blackness in the 18th century was a kind of fluid term, where it referred to different populations in different ways. And this is happening in South Asia too, where Blackness in an Atlantic context and Blackness in an Indian Ocean context are made equivalent through these dictionaries. For example, one of the dictionary entries that I did not want to share, actually, because it just contains all these racial slurs and all this kind of violence, that I do not want to share in my presentation, but one of the entries is about Black, where he talks about Black people both as Habshi and Shidi, but also using more specific terms and concepts that are taken from the Atlantic. And this also happens in translations of the Oriental tales that I talk about. So, for example, in Bago Bahar, Black people are often mentioned as Habshi or Shidi, but in English or French translations of that novel, they're referred to by concepts and words that are taken from the Atlantic Ocean. So there is this kind of equivalence and a kind of ahistorical thinking about Blackness that kind of equates Black people in different geographies, while also differentiating them in different ways. So, I think this question about how they deal with the existing African populations in South Asia also kind of reveals a lot about how they think about race in some ways, both in terms of how they erase this history and how they equate it to Atlantic concepts. And I think this kind of speaks to the question in the chat as well, because I think often the way Indian Ocean studies proceeds is by creating a separation from the Atlantic or as a corrective to the Atlantic, maybe because there's not as much scholarship on the Indian Ocean. So there is this sense that the Indian Ocean has to be asserted in some ways as a differential category, which I think is true in some ways and justified in some ways. But also I think that the Atlantic is a kind of foundational category for race in the modern world that cannot be ignored. And a lot of its concepts and a lot of its ideas do seep into these Indian Ocean histories, So I think to think of race in the Indian Ocean and in Afro-Asian relations simply as talking about Habshi or Shidi communities is also not accurate, because these Atlantic ideas that come through British colonialism kind of fundamentally shape how we think about race, and so I would also like to think about like the kind of relevance and prominence of Atlantic Ocean ideas to Indian Ocean histories of race in this scholarship. And lastly, you talked about Joginder Paul and how kind of anti-colonial writers and artists thought about repairing relations between Afro-Asia. And that I think is a really important part, maybe even more important than this philological work. And I hope to work on that. That's kind of my idea in the second part of my research, is is that I want to talk about how anti-colonial translations and writers kind of tried to repair these relations between Afro-Asia, and how kind of shared anti-colonial struggles can transform relations between different colonies and people. So in terms of that, I just wanted to quickly show the painting that you talked about, which is this this painting by Shazia Sikandar, who's a contemporary Pakistani artist, and it's called X, and it takes inspiration from Malcolm X, but it is a painting that's written through Urdu poetry, specifically Ghalib's poetry. So it uses this poetry to kind of create this image of X, which I find really interesting in terms of, not just because, I want to think of these solidarities not only in the anti-colonial period, say in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but also how they continue kind of in our contemporary times. And I think that this painting is one way to think about that. But hopefully I can present more on that work later. For now, I kind of wanted to focus on Gilchrist and this early version of like British philological Afro-Asia. But yeah, thank you so much again for your questions and engagement.
Thank you, Haider. I think, in many ways, some of your comments towards the end were starting to answer one of the questions that Kelvin had put in, and I'll read the whole thing, and I also invite then the other participants if they want to jump in at this point. And what we'll do, just to also facilitate a more, at this stage, a kind of somewhat informal discussion, is I'm going to stop the recording. So, and we can just create imagine this is the sort of phase where we're moving from the formal presentations to conversations that happen right after a talk is given, right? And often those encounters are really productive. So this is our Zoom attempt to do that. So I'll, and just I should stop the recording, right? Not pause it, stop. Okay, perfect.